Jean Grey is finally making it into Marvel Snap, but I think her effect is going to be quite polarizing. It's going to be really interesting to see, but here we have Jean Grey. She's a 3/3 ongoing. Players must play their first card here each turn if possible. That's a very important note in the brackets there. But Jean Grey, I mean, I'm just so hyped for this card. I think the effect looks moderately fun, but the reason I say it's going to be polarizing is I think it's going to be really, really frustrating after a while. A lot of players just want to play their cards out. This is going to make it that much harder to play your cards in the spots that you want to, but regardless, the variants are absolute fire, so enjoy looking at those, and let's get into the mechanics of Jean Grey. All right, so there's a couple of important notes here with Jean Grey. So like it said in the quotations, if possible, right? So if her location is full, it is no longer possible to play there. Therefore, you can play anywhere else that you want to. But now you've already filled that location, so you only have 2 other locations to choose from. Let's say your opponent is also running Jean Grey, but they play her at a different location than where you played yours. Well, you can now choose where you want to play that first card. It's only limited to the first card that you play, and essentially after that, the effect disappears. It's very reminiscent of the location Morag, but it's the opposite, right? So with Morag, you have to play your first card elsewhere, not at Morag, and then you can play wherever you want. So Jean Grey is doing the reverse, where you have to play the first card at her location, and then you're free to do what you want. All right, and similar to how if the location is full, if the location is unplayable, well, now you can play wherever you want. That's something like storm flooding the location. If Jean Grey is somehow moved over to Sanctum Sanctorum, there's a few weird ways that could come up in your games, and essentially it would make her effect a non-factor in the game moving forward unless somehow you're able to play cards there eventually. A really interesting one here is Jeff, because Jeff goes where Jeff wants to, and how does that work when you're location restricted based on Jean Grey's effect? Well, the simplest way I can put it is with Morag, right? I recently had this come up in a game where I had Jeff in hand and Morag was on the field. I played Jeff at Morag because he doesn't care, and then the second card wasn't limited to that restriction because it's only affecting the first card. So my interpretation is that you could play Jeff elsewhere. It'll trigger as the first card played, and then you're free to play your second card wherever you want, at the Jean Grey location or off of it. The bigger question that I have when it comes to Jeff is what happens when Jean Grey is at an unplayable location. So let's say you played Storm and it flooded the location and you have Jean Grey there. Now you can't play any cards there. It's not possible, so you don't really have to worry about the effect. But if you have Jeff in hand, he can be played anywhere. So is the game going to tell you, well, you have Jeff, you have to play him? It doesn't have to be at Jean Grey's location, but it's got to be somewhere because he is a playable card that could have the potential to go to Jean Grey's location. I actually think that's how it's going to work. So in theory, it could actually backfire on you if you go for that control style, because maybe at that point in time, you don't have the available energy to play another card, and then you're just stuck with playing Jeff forced from your hand. But I could also see it not working like that. Jeff does what he wants, and maybe the restriction isn't going to limit the cards that you can play from your hand. I don't know exactly how that's going to function. All right, so what are some of the pros to Jean Grey? So there's actually a lot of pros, and there's very few downsides. There's very few counters, in my opinion. We're going to get to those in a second, but I think it's going to punish slow decks that want to play one card at a time, don't have the available energy or cheap cards in their deck lists to just throw something out at the Jean Grey location and play their big power play elsewhere. So anything slow is going to have quite the hard time, I imagine, unless they're cheating stuff out like Doctor Doom. So there's ups and downs, but it's going to definitely telegraph where your opponent's playing. Right? They have to put a card there unless they are running Jeff. So I think like Guardians of the Galaxy cards or anything that gets extra value of knowing where your opponent's going to at least commit a bit of their resources is going to benefit in the long run. But there are some downsides. For instance, it's a reciprocal effect. If somehow your opponent is running a deck that benefits from this, or maybe they're literally running the same list, if it's a mirror matchup, but they didn't draw Jean Grey and then you played it, you're essentially doing them a favor and you just gave yourself 3 power on the board. Now, of course, like you might have better cards in hand to play against them, but because the effect is doing something for you and your opponent, there's no upside directly for you unless you brought better cards to the table in your deck list, then it might backfire. There's the potential for it to just backfire or just not do enough to find you a win. Then location variance is going to add an extra layer, kind of just what I was mentioning, more locations that restrict things. All of a sudden, you're being sneaky and plan on playing elsewhere, so you're restricting up one location, But then the other one becomes restricted, like with Professor X, or just it's a Sanctum Sanctorum. And now there's only one location to play at anyways, and you committed 3 power there, and it doesn't matter. Like, it's just going to get a little bit tricky. And lastly, and probably the most important thing that I wanted to discuss about is I think this is going to be a very frustrating card. I think this is going to tilt so many players, and I think in about, honestly, maybe even a week, 2 weeks, a month, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think people are going to be like, this is trash. We should nerf this, just because it's frustrating experience, frustrating to play against. It reminds me a lot of Sandman. Like, Sandman ended up getting buffed and became top of the meta, but it's such a frustrating card because if you're playing like a bounce deck or just anything that wants to play a bunch of cards at once, completely shuts it down. And it's not the most positive experience when that happens. When you can't play your cards to the fullest, it can generate a frustrating experience. That said, it's not the worst, right? You just have to fill that location, you're good to go, or you just have to, play a card there first. It's not as bad as Sandman, but I think eventually people are going to get a little bit upset. It reminds me of when new locations come out and they restrict gameplay and they're featured 50% of the time. Like, this card is going to be everywhere in the first week. Everyone's going to be opening up their spotlight caches and picking up Jean Grey. So just look out for it. All right, now for some counters for Jean Grey. Now I have a question mark there because, man, a lot of these work well with her. They're like synergistic cards. But if your opponent happens to be running them, then it kind of makes her effect not as valuable because they can kind of take advantage of her effect. So that's why I have them here. I feel like the only true counter is Enchantress, because basically you play Jean Grey on 3 and then they Enchantress at the Jean Grey location anyways. On turn 4, it's a nice curve for them. They remove her ability and then they can play wherever they want on turns 5 and 6 respectively. So I feel like that could be the most true counter. But otherwise, like Echo, even though, she's not out yet, she's coming next week, but I wanted to put her here because she could remove the ongoing ability of Jean Grey if you snipe that location, right? You played Echo and then Jean Grey comes down because Echo removes ongoing abilities of the cards played after she is revealed, right? But you could set that up with Jean Grey because it only affects opponent's cards. So you could have that at the Jean Grey location, play her, and then anytime your opponent wants to play an ongoing card, it's going to get it removed because they have to play there first. So like that could be a nice little combo in its own right. Same with Storm. I have Storm here as a counter because if your opponent floods the location in time, then on their final turn or turn 5 or however, whenever they can do it, now they're not restricted by Jean Grey's effect. So in a roundabout way, they get away from it. But at the same time, I could see that working with Jean Grey in a Surfer package. So I feel like that could be a good combo. So I don't know if it's a direct counter, but it's a way to get away from her effect. And then like Kitty Pryde. So Kitty Pryde is super popular right now, right? But she works so well with Jean Grey because that can be your first card that you play anyways. You wanted to play there. It doesn't fill the location, so you have the option to play cards there later, and you're going to get it back and get that power boost. You wanted to play it anyways. So it just works beautifully. And then Jeff is the same thing like I was talking about earlier. Now you don't even have to play your first card at Jean Grey's location. You can just play Jeff wherever you want. And then finally, there's cards like Doctor Doom, there's cards like Ultron, and these sorts of things that are going to generate cards elsewhere. There's even the entire move package that could, work really well here, like Vision and Nightcrawler. I just kind of admitted those a little bit weaker. But you play Doctor Doom at Jean Grey's location, it gives you the 4 power Doom bots elsewhere. That's a pretty nice turn 6. So all in all, I don't see this card having that many true counters. There's not going to be something that your opponent's holding on to that's really going to give Jean Grey a super hard time other than Enchantress. All right, theory crafting time. Let's go. So I have 3 decks for you guys here today, but I'm also going to have a 4th one because I thought of so many crazy decks. There's so much that could work with this card. I'm going to have a 4th one in the article on snap.fan. I'll have the link in the description below, so definitely go check it out. But here I have some fun ones all about the genes. So some of the key synergies is Silver Surfer. It's a 3-cost card. It's going to get the +2 power. It works so well. I think that's going to be the best deck for Jean Grey. Kitty Pryde, just like I was mentioning, you can play her and it's great. You get the power. Wave. Wow, Wave is wild to me because if you play Jean Grey even on turn 4 and then you wave on 5, your opponent can only play 1 card, and provided that they have not filled Jean Grey's location, it has to be there. That is crazy. And then if you have Dr. Doom in hand, boom, it's over. You get power over elsewhere and you're good to go. And then we got Drax here. I put Drax actually above all the other Guardians of the Galaxy cards because he's 4 cost, and then you can play it right after the Jean Grey play, and that's most likely when your opponent's going to commit a card there. So he gets his little +2 power. But basically all the Guardians characters benefit from Jean Grey. And then Brood. That's probably one of the better ones, and it goes really well with Silver Surfer because you fill your location. If you fill the location, it's no longer a reciprocal effect. Now it's only affecting your opponent. I think that's key. There's like a lot of, we could look at Mr. Sinister, right? Or just really anything that's going to put a lot of cards on your side of the board. But I thought Brood was the best one because if we run it with the Surfer package, we're going to get a lot of power. So speaking of Surfer, let's look at Surfer Genes here. So this is basically just typical Surfer deck. Honestly, I just took like what I think is one of the better Surfer decks right now, and I threw in Jean Grey. And the idea being is that we play Jean, and then we play Brood on 4. Boom, we filled the location with 4 3-cost cards, right? And then later down the line, we do Sarah on turn 5, and then we play 3 3-cost cards, including Silver Surfer, who's going to buff all of those cards that I just mentioned with a bunch of power, while our opponents are stuck trying to figure out how to play out their hand based on the restriction that Jean Grey is providing. I think it is such a strong list. We could even storm a location elsewhere at some point in time. We could goose a location elsewhere because we're not running anything that is high cost, and I feel like this is going to work so nicely. You also got the Nova Killmonger combo just to get a bit of extra power at that location, and we know that our opponent's going to be committing power there, and if we just get, I don't know, like the Nova explosion plus the Surfer buffs, like that location is going to be stacked. So I feel like it'd be a really hard time for your opponent to compete with that. Then we got Bouncy Jeans. So this is a bounce list. Again, I feel like she just slots right into these meta decks, and we have Bounce being one of the stronger lists right now. Now, provided she's going to be released when there's balance changes projected to be announced, so maybe these lists get hit or hurt some fashion. So this is theory crafting, right? We're just thinking in a preview sense, but right now, if nothing changes with the Bounce list, I could see this working beautifully. The idea being that we throw out Jean Grey and we have a lot of cheap stuff that's easy to play at her location. And then if we got to throw it back with Beast, then we do that. I really like Nebula because she's just going to harvest power at a different location away from Jean Grey. Meanwhile, we're playing Kitty Pryde on repeat at Jean Grey's location, buffing our Collector, buffing our Bishop, buffing our Angela, anything like that for that big final turn where you play Kitty Pryde, hit Monkey, or whatever else you got cooking, and it's happy days. And then my last one that I think I'm most excited because I think this is the most unique take on Jean Grey is Robo Jeans. So it's basically your Ultron list, but I also got Dr. Doom as a backup. So it's one or the other. That's the idea here. You're going to play Ultron or Dr. Doom at the Jean Grey location. And then we're also going to set up with like Blue Marvel, Kazar, Patriot, not all of them, but 1 or 2, right? Just to give those drones a bit of a buff. And then we got Jeff, Mojo for the early game to throw them elsewhere. We got Wasp in case we just want to play that at the Jean Grey location because we got to get power elsewhere, then we'll do so. And then Misty Knight and Squirrel Girl, again, just like no ability stuff to give buffs from Patriot. I think this deck could work really nicely and surprise a lot of people. I don't imagine they're going to put counters like Cosmo at Jean Grey's location, but if they did, then this deck gets shut down pretty hard. But we could also reverse it, right? If you throw down the Wasp at Jean Grey's location and then you play Dr. Doom elsewhere, well, then that is going to work in reverse. So I feel like it's not too bad. You could navigate around some of those counters. And the cherry on top is that we're running Wave. And the idea, again, is that we wave on turn 5 so that on turn 6, we play Dr. Doom or Ultron, and your opponent can only play 1 card. And if Jean Grey's location is not filled, they have to play there. That feels like, to me, a checkmate. All right, let me know if you're picking up Jean Grey in the comments below. I'm curious to how many people are actually going to pick up this card. I think a lot of people are excited about it. The variants are just too good. This art germ is insane. I love them all, and I think for that reason alone that I want this card, even if I don't end up playing it a whole bunch. But I do think she's going to be meta relevant, and in my snap or pass decision making here, I would probably lean towards a snap buy. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and I'll catch you guys next time.